In 2008, Catherine Daviau was a 26-year-old resident of a triplex apartment on 5th Avenue in the Rosemont-La Petite Patrie part of Montreal. Catherine was a private person, and the details of her profession and her personal life remain largely unknown to the media. On December 11, 2008, emergency services received a call about a fire breaking out in an apartment on 5th Avenue in Rosemont. When firefighters arrived on scene, they found the apartment door locked tight, with no signs of forced entry from outside. With a few heavy blows, they broke down the door and pushed their way inside. Then, the beam of a flashlight swept across the small, cluttered room and came to rest on the bed. There lay Catherine. She was motionless, her body twisted in a way that told rescuers instantly that she had not died peacefully. She was naked and bound, her wrists tied, the sheets tangled up around her legs. On her were bruises and marks, signs of an intense struggle, artifacts that her heart had pumped blood while she endured such brutal violence for far too long. The firefighters who entered that apartment were trained to handle tragedy, but what they saw that night would stay with them forever. Because of the lack of forced entry, police believed that Catherine knew her killer. This, they say, could be why the killer had attempted to remove evidence by setting the apartment on fire, using Catherine's own perfume as an accelerant, and then leaving the premises. Investigators interviewed friends, family, co-workers, and acquaintances in hopes of finding any leads. What they learned was that in the days leading up to her death, Catherine had placed an online classified advertisement to sell her car. The arrangement had seemed to proceed as expected. Catherine had mentioned to a coworker that a prospective buyer, a man she did not know, had arranged to see the vehicle on Wednesday, December 10th, 2008. However, the man never arrived for the appointment. In retrospect, police would come to believe that this was not a casual missed connection, but a calculated part of a larger plan. The hypothesis formed by investigators years later was that the killer may have used the pretext of the appointment in order to observe Catherine, to learn her routine, and to confirm her location without revealing his identity. The day after the missed appointment, Thursday, December 11th, was the last day of Catherine's life. On that day, Catherine had worked a full shift at a company on the west side of Montreal, finishing her shift around 4:30 p.m. She then took Highway 40, heading east to return home. Due to heavy traffic that day, police estimated she likely arrived home around 5:30 p.m. Police believed she was likely killed between 5:30 p.m. and 7 p.m. Forensic specialists from Quebec's Provincial Crime Lab, the Laboratoire de Sciences Judiciaires et de Médecine Légale, or the LSJML, meticulously examined the scene. Miraculously, the fire had not destroyed everything. They successfully recovered traces of the suspect's DNA, and working with this evidence, the lab scientists were able to build a complete DNA profile of an unknown male perpetrator. Working with this evidence, the lab scientists were able to produce a complete DNA profile of an unknown male perpetrator that same year in 2008. Men who may have been in contact with Catherine were asked to provide DNA samples, but none matched to the DNA left at the crime scene. With the suspect's DNA profile in hand, investigators turned to the most powerful tool available to them at the time, Canada's National DNA Databank. This federal database contains the genetic profiles of individuals convicted of designated offenses. However, no matches were found there either. With few leads, the case soon went cold. 10 years later, in 2018, police sent DNA samples recovered from the crime scene to a laboratory in the United States. There, DNA phenotyping was used to determine the suspect's physical characteristics, and a composite sketch was made. However, no leads would come of this either. For 17 years, the killer remained at large. But in the fall of 2024, using genetic genealogy, authorities found a distant relative of the killer. A professional genealogist then spent 8 months building a family tree from that link. By eliminating individuals based on their age, sex, and location, detectives narrowed down the list of potential suspects to just one name: Jacques Bolduc. Bolduc was a career criminal who was a complete stranger to Catherine Daviau. His criminal record, dating back to 1979, was filled with armed robberies and attempted murders. At the time of the murder, Bolduc was on parole and living in a halfway house. On the night of December 11th, after he killed Catherine, he violated his parole by not returning to the halfway home. Just 2 days later, he was arrested for an unrelated attempted car theft. During this arrest, his cell phone was confiscated. The number was eventually reassigned to a new user, a seemingly minor administrative detail that had major consequences, as it made it impossible for investigators to later trace the phone call he had made to Catherine by analyzing her phone records. Bolduc was a known violent offender, in violation of his parole, arrested just 2 days after the murder, and yet no connection was ever made. He was eventually arrested again in 2017 after a violent crime spree in which he shot 2 people during separate armed robberies. In 2020, he was declared a, quote, dangerous offender and sentenced to an indeterminate prison term. He died of natural causes in a federal penitentiary in September of 2021. His age was unlisted in the prison announcement, and no digital footprint of his could be found. A court order to collect his DNA following the 2020 sentencing was never carried out due to pandemic-related delays, a failure that kept his identity hidden for 4 more years. After Bolduc's death in 2021, his body was cremated, making a direct DNA match impossible. To confirm their findings, investigators obtained a DNA sample from a close relative of his. The LSJML confirmed that the crime scene DNA was compatible with that of a close family member, providing the scientific certainty needed to close the case. On September 17, 2025, Montreal police announced that the murder of Catherine Daviau was finally solved. But because the suspect had already died, there would never be a trial. For Catherine's family, the news brought answers but not peace. The man who took her life had been free for years, living out the time that Catherine never got to have. Carol Ann Doherty loved 2 things most of all: turning the pages of mystery books and riding her blue and white Londoner bike around the neighborhood. She was 9, a 5th grader at St. Mark's Catholic School on Radcliffe Street, and lived with her parents, Frank and Dorothy, at 68 Manor Circle in Bristol Township. She was bright, sweet-natured, and impossible to dislike. The Doherty family was deeply religious, and St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church held special significance in their lives. The church, located at 1025 Radcliffe Street, was not only where Carol attended school, but also served as her family's parish where they regularly worshipped. On the afternoon of October 22, 1962, Carol left her home with plans to visit the Bristol Free Library, to return 2 books she had just finished, and to check out the next books in a mystery series she was reading. The day was warm and clear as the 5th grader rode her bicycle toward town. During her journey, Carol made several stops that were later documented by witnesses. She stopped at Tommy's on Farragut Avenue to purchase a Coca-Cola and some penny candy, then continued traveling down Lincoln Avenue. As was her habit when passing any Catholic church, Carol stopped in at St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church to say a prayer. This would be the last time that Carol Ann Doherty was seen alive. She never made it home. When she didn't return by 4:30 p.m. for dinner, her parents, Frank and Dorothy, began searching. Dorothy spotted Carol's blue and white Londoner racing bike outside St. Mark's Church and told Frank to check inside. Around 6:00 p.m., Frank entered the church and made a horrific discovery on the stairs of the choir loft: his own daughter's body. Carol had been sexually assaulted and strangled with a ligature. Her younger sister, Kay, later recalled the inhuman noises her father made when he came back to the car and warned them not to go inside. The police were immediately called, but all involved already knew deep in their stomachs that it was too late for Carol or her family, who had just experienced the most horrific thing a parent and a child could ever endure. Bristol Police, led by Chief Vincent Faragalli, worked with the Pennsylvania State Police under Sergeant Andrew Cutney investigators concluded the attack likely occurred around 3:35 p.m. when Carol was alone in the empty church, most likely saying her prayers. Evidence collected disturbingly included several adult brown pubic hairs clutched in her hand, suggesting a final act of courage and resistance. Crime scene technicians also found discarded Lucky Strike cigarettes at the scene, which were preserved for future testing. Over the decades, the investigation focused on several suspects. The first one was Frank Zucchero, an aging handyman who was seen drunk near the church and initially confessed to the murder. However, his confession was later deemed unreliable as he appeared delusional, and subsequently, the investigating officer admitted to coercing the confession from him. Another suspect was Wayne Roach, a 19-year-old whose parents reported finding Carol's name written in his notebook. He was tracked to Virginia, but later provided a verified alibi. A damaging detour came when investigators zeroed in on Father Joseph Sabadash of St. Mark's Church, after he was caught lying about his whereabouts during the murder time window. However, he had fabricated the alibi not because he was involved in Carol's death, but to hide an affair with a married woman. In 2016, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office reviewed Father Sabadash during a wider clergy abuse inquiry and confirmed that he was elsewhere at the time, finding no link to Carol's murder. In the later years, investigators reopened the files and applied new forensic techniques. One of the early suspects identified was William Schrader. He had lived only a block and a half away from St. Mark's Church on Lincoln Avenue. This proximity gave him intimate knowledge of the immediate neighborhood, and a witness placed him outside the church around the estimated time of the murder, 3:35 p.m. In 1963, police had asked him to provide a pubic hair sample, but it was never tested. It wasn't until 30 years later that a DNA analyst compared the pubic hairs from the church to the sample collected from Schrader. The hair on Carol's hand showed what they said was, quote, significant similarities to Schrader's sample. Of 141 samples tested over the decades, Schrader's was the only one that could not be excluded as the source of the hair. Police also noted circumstantial clues. Schrader had lived less than a block from St. Mark's, had failed a lie detector test in 1963, and was known to smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes, the same brand found at the crime scene. However, none of this evidence was enough to charge him at the time. The case remained open for over 60 years, transforming from an active investigation into a persistent cold case, always awaiting the critical breakthrough that technology or human memory might provide. In November of 2024, investigators interviewed Robert LeBlanc, William Schrader's stepson, who revealed that Schrader had confessed to him on 2 separate occasions about murdering a little girl in a Pennsylvania church. According to the stepson, Schrader admitted that he had lured Carol inside, raped her, and then, quote, had to kill the girl to keep her from talking. The stepson's account included details not mentioned to the media, such as the exact location of Carol's bicycle. This confession was considered highly credible because LeBlanc had no prior knowledge of specific case details. This is something only the perpetrator would have known. Taken together with the long-suspected DNA link, these confessions convinced prosecutors that they finally had the case solved. William Schrader, originally from Luzerne County, had moved to Bristol where his brother and sister-in-law lived. His criminal history was extensive, beginning in childhood when he was sent to reform school for sexually assaulting girls. He later joined the Army but was dishonorably discharged and served time at Eastern State Penitentiary for attempted murder after shooting another man in Luzerne County. At the time of Carol's murder, Schrader was living on Lincoln Avenue, within a 5-minute walk of St. Mark's Church. When questioned by police in early 1963, he lied about his alibi, claiming he had been at work during the time of the murder. However, investigators discovered through time cards that he had not shown up to work for 3 consecutive days, including the day of the murder. After providing a pubic hair sample and knowing that he was a suspect, Schrader fled to Florida in January of 1963, eventually settling in Louisiana. Schrader's pattern of violence, however, continued throughout his life. Before I continue, I want to give a strong content warning. The next part of the story involves graphic and disturbing accounts of sexual abuse and violence against children. While living in Louisiana, he married a woman named Audrey Schrader, who had an adult daughter and an underage daughter, both of whom had special needs. Schrader began to sexually abuse both of his stepdaughters and later conceived a child with one of them. Schrader then began sexually assaulting his own child for years after she turned 8 years old. Schrader and his wife later adopted a 2-year-old girl and allowed Catherine Smith, the 12-year-old girl who was their neighbor, to live inside their home. Schrader began targeting Catherine, sneaking into her bedroom, and eventually the girl's bedroom door was locked so that Schrader could no longer victimize her. Then, on Halloween of 1970, Schrader physically assaulted his wife following an argument, prompting her adult son to kick Schrader out of the home. As he gathered his things, he told his family, quote, "I'm coming back and I'm going to burn the house down and kill all the bitches inside it." Later that night, a fire was set at the home. While the adults were able to escape, Smith was locked inside the bedroom and died protecting her 2-year-old foster sister by placing her body on top of her. The 2-year-old girl survived the fire, but then was sexually abused by Schrader as she got older. Family members eventually came forward and provided information on Catherine's death. Years later, Schrader was arrested and convicted of manslaughter and arson, both in connection to the deadly fire in 1985. He died in prison in 2002 at the age of 62. 5 years after his death, his stepson, Robert LeBlanc, confided in a trusted member of law enforcement in Louisiana. He revealed that his stepfather had admitted to raping and murdering a young girl inside a Catholic church in Pennsylvania, the same town where he had lived before fleeing to the South. Unfortunately, this crucial information did not reach the active team of investigators until many years later, when the current team learned of the confession and interviewed Robert LeBlanc in 2024. On October 29, 2025, Bucks County District Attorney Jennifer Shorn announced that a special investigative grand jury had formally identified William Schrader as Carol's killer. Schrader was described by the DA's office as, quote, "an absolute predator whose life was marked by a pattern of violence and sexual violence." The grand jury report, a 53-page document approved by the court, concluded that Schrader committed first-degree rape and murder of Carol. Prosecutors emphasized that this finding was based on the combination of the decades-old forensic evidence and the new witness testimony. In their words, Schrader is now, quote, "definitively linked to the crime, even though he is dead." With no living suspects to prosecute, the grand jury's report serves as the official conclusion of the case. Investigators say they hope this resolution would at least bring some peace to Carol's grieving family, as her sister Kay, who was just 3 years old at the time of the murder, tearfully remarked, "Living, quote, for exactly 63 years without answers has been its own burden." Kay Dotery said that finally receiving some answers, quote, "brings closure and truth to a wound that never healed."